Welcome to the seminar, research seminar at Institute for Future Studies. My name is Emeritus. I'm a researcher here. And today's research seminar is a collaboration is part of a research collaboration between Institute for Future Studies and the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security and Society. It's part of a project funded by the Swedish MSB and the Canadian DRDC, which stands for Defense Research and Development Canada. And it's a privilege to introduce Lorne. For us working in the field of extremism, Lorne is one of the leading scholars in this field. But for those that are just listening in, Lorne is a full professor in Department of Religious Studies and Department of Sociology and Legal Studies at Waterloo University. That was correct?
University of Waterloo, yeah.
University. Sorry. He has served as the chair of both departments. In 2012, he co-founded the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security and Society, TSATS, and he is currently the co-director of TSATS. And your publication is enormous. You have 3 books, 5 edited books, 85 academic articles and book chapters.
89 now.
89, sorry. You need to update your website. And as I said, it has been a privilege to collaborate with you because you are leading the Canadian research team in our research project. And today's research seminar will be about reconceptualization. Lone actor terrorists as solo public mass murderers, a very topic in Sweden because we recently had a solo attack in Almedalen, which is a political gathering here in Sweden, unfortunately with one casualty, and it's now under trial. So with those words, before I'm just also need to say that this seminar will be recorded and uploaded later, even the Q&A part, and we have it's a hybrid, so we have people sitting in the room and we have people online. Those online, please write your name when you are asking question, and we will then read up your questions. With those words, please, Lorne.
Great. Thanks very much, Amir. Really pleased to be here. It's always great to arrive in Stockholm and come to the Futures Institute and to get together with all of our partners in this collaboration between Sweden and Canada dealing with organized violent threats. This research that I'm talking about today didn't directly grow out of this particular project, but it's reflective of the very kinds of issues that we're interested in the project, right? And I'm not presenting original research. This is really, I'll give you the context in a moment in full detail. It's more an overview of sort of the state of the art of what's happening in a certain body of literature at the time. And it grew out of a specific incident as well, right? So outside of Canada, probably there's not a whole lot of awareness of this, but Canada in April of 2020 had a mass casualty incident, and a very large one. A very significant one in a Canadian context, right? It was quite frightening. It caused a huge amount of attention and concern in Canada. So Gabriel Wortman, a 51-year-old denturist, went on a rampage shooting. And so it lasted 13 hours. And over April 18th and 19th, resulted in 22 deaths, including a police officer, and in 6 people being injured and a number of homes being burnt to the ground. What makes this even more kind of intriguing is Gabriel Wortman, very unusual individual, but he'd spent a great deal of his life as a sort of aficionado of everything dealing with policing. So he had actually created 2 absolute replica police cars. And he created a replica of the police uniform and the armaments and everything else, so that he literally, the RCMP, our National Police Force, could not differentiate between him and actual police. And in the end, the only way they were able to differentiate was the fact that someone got a picture of the car and they noticed that the number on the police car was a non-existent number. And so they had to notify the other police to look for this police car that had this, fictional number on the car. Otherwise, that's why the one police officer was killed, because the one police officer knew that he was in the area, but actually thought she was meeting with another RCMP officer, and he literally drove up beside her and shot her in her car, right? So it was a pretty horrific event all around, and naturally enough, it led to a government inquiry. So you had a mass casualty commission convened in Canada, and this research is part of is just reflecting on sort of a summary analysis of work we did for a report for the commission, the commissioners in the mass casualty investigation. Now, just to put it in a little context, part of the report we did was actually just because this had never been done, was to assess how many mass casualty events had there been in Canada. A mass casualty event, we just use, there's all kinds of problems, as people who are aware of this literature probably knows, in defining what constitutes a mass casualty event. There is no definition in the Canadian context, so part of this report, done largely under the leadership of David Hoffman, my colleague, and part of our larger collaboration, was to just identify in a Canadian context what is a mass casualty event. We inevitably ended up using the kind of arbitrary definition that's used in the United States, which is the FBI saying anything involving more than 4 fatalities is a mass casualty event. If you use that criteria and other ones that we worked into a definition, we demonstrated that between 1970 and 2021, there have been 41 mass casualty events in Canada, which is terrible. But of course, as we all know, just to put it in relative perspective, in the United States, regrettably, they probably have 41 mass casualty events in the course of maybe a month or two. So, you know, it has to be put in perspective. In Canada, obviously, we have a decidedly non-violent society in certain relative sense. We're very lucky there's been only these small number of mass casualty events. But still, for any society, 41 is too many. And nobody wanted a replication of what happened in Nova Scotia with Gabriel Wortman. The other part of the report, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, was taking a look at research on perpetrators of these kinds of events. And we looked at both research on so-called lone actor terrorists, and we looked at the research on public mass murderers. Now, both those terms are problematic, both subject to all kinds of, different kinds of definitions. And the point of my talk today is not to get into the nitty-gritty of that. We really took a very broad cast and looked at all the research on anything that had been sort of identified by those categories. And the object was to produce a summary analysis for the commissioners, right? So that they could have a sense of how would this inform their inquiry. So it was approximately 50 studies that I was primarily responsible for looking at. I say approximately because there are very fuzzy boundaries to this literature, right? So there's studies that we included that weren't necessarily directly about one of these things, but were pertinent to understanding this phenomenon. So it's roughly about 40 studies. The main reason for doing this is because there is a lot of new, relatively recent literature that is very pertinent and that is quite, it's innovative, right? It's changing people's conceptions of what's going on. So there's a whole series of new quantitative studies that are based on dedicated data sets, mainly from open sources, but a few involving closed sources of data. There are lots of new good case studies available using different techniques or frameworks for understanding what's going on. And then now we're getting some systematic reviews of all this literature, and that's new too. We didn't have these systematic reviews before. So that's all encompassed in these 50 studies. And the main thing that emerges when you plunge into this is that it's increasingly becoming apparent that what looked to be originally different kinds of phenomenon, so-called lone actor terrorist events versus public mass murderers, and I'll explain this a little bit more in the next slide, really are looking more like they're similar, right? There's a convergence. When you actually get good data, you start to realize that the sort of distinctions we tend to commonly make between these phenomena don't have a very sound foundation. In fact, now we're getting a convergence. So we have mass casualty incidents or mass casualty perpetrators that are a types, and I think really I talk about solo public mass murderers, and really in a way I would use that now as the generic label to include so-called lone actor terrorists. I would classify them as a form of solo public mass murderer. So what you're getting today is really just, as I say, an exercise in some knowledge translation. This is just giving you the gist of what you learn from looking at all these studies. It's down to just 9 points, 9 takeaway points. I'm not going to give you, I'm not giving you the data. I'm not giving you a lot of nitty-gritty details. I'm giving you the easily takeaway points. But of course, in questions, we can go into some of the detail if you want. And admittedly, it's from the perspective of someone who's a sociologist who spent time studying terrorism and violent extremism. So a lot of this material is psychological in nature. I don't pretend to be a psychologist, right? So I'm just reporting what those who do have capability in that regard have said in some of their publications. Now, to get a little bit of a sense of, sort of on a kind of common sense basis, like why are we sort of looking at this? What's the sort of context? What's the explanatory issues? It's important to understand these things, but it's kind of a mess when you go into this sort of background here. So I've reduced what is really a complicated set of questions that crop up in public discussions of this and in academic discussions to sort of 3 issues. One is a really just broad problem that you encounter in dealing with this literature all the time. Anything dealing with terrorism or dealing with public mass murder situations, there's such tremendous repugnance about what's happened. They're so morally shocking, these events, that we are really massively inclined to look for some kind of anomaly to account for it, right? The perpetrators must be suffering from some kind of serious problems or issues that differentiate them from others, and even from other criminals, right? So there seem to be a unique class of individuals. And that kind of normative orientation just persists. It persists no matter what the data comes out. So you have to always keep that in mind. There's drive to find anomaly, but is there really anomaly there in a significant way? Now, ironically, from a terrorism scholarship perspective, pushing back somewhat the other way, whenever it's revealed that some terrorist has significant mental health issues, immediately a debate arises about whether the episode, the incident they're involved in, can legitimately be classed as terrorism if the perpetrator was suffering from mental illness. And that set off all kinds of debates in the United States. So a good example is the Orlando nightclub shooter. Well, as soon as it was found out that maybe he had issues around his sexual identity, that's why he attacked a gay club. He had various kinds of, he had never been diagnosed with a mental illness, but he certainly had shown some mental instability in the past. So it immediately caused people to question, well, this isn't really a terrorist event. And we've had this happen in Canada with episodes too, where others push back and say, it is irrelevant whether the individual is suffering from mental illness or not, to determine whether the event itself was a terrorist event. So there's all kinds of debate about that. And in most cases, you can't make a firm determination because we lack any clear enough data about the cases. And overall, there has always also been, thirdly, this pressing need to come up with some kind of profile of these individuals, because governments want some way, assured way of interdicting them, right? Of stopping these events, of preventing it from happening. But as many of you listening to this would be aware, the attempt to derive a profile, to get more specific about who are the individuals that are likely to perpetrate these events, have not been successful. So you get these kind of background issues that are murky and muddy things up. So with that in mind, as the object here was to say, let's guide the commissioners through the literature to see what can you take out of this really growing body of literature, and in many cases very complex statistical analysis of data sets. What are the kind of broad general takeaways you can get? And I'll try and be careful to stick to my numbering I've presented this before in the past, and the problem was, of course, I got so carried away in my talk, I forgot all about the numbers, and so I'm like, oh, I'm talking about number 4, and the last thing I mentioned was number 2. So I'll try this time to stick very carefully to make sure we go through these, methodically one by one. So the first one is actually, when you look at all the data, which is now quite rich, there is a profile that emerges, but the problem is the profile is very broad, right? And it does conform to the kind of broad profile that people have had in mind for a long time as to who perpetrates these incidents of mass casualty incidents. And so we are dealing largely with, overwhelmingly, I shouldn't say largely, overwhelmingly with male perpetrators. That's the single one thing you can probably say warrants being seen as a profiling factor. And I'm not going to be addressing it here, but one of the other reports to the commission, so if you want to go on their website, you can see these reports. One of the other reports was with experts specifically focusing on the gendered character of these attacks. So they're male, they're white, they're mid to late 30s. The majority are single or divorced. The majority have relatively low levels of education. 40% have some prior criminal record or a history of mental illness. I'm using ballpark figures because, of course, it varies, but really it's around the 40% mark in almost all the studies, it turns out, for both the criminal past and mental illness issues. Sizable minority there's evidence of being socially marginalized. Many are unemployed. There's clear evidence of all kinds of various stresses and strains in their lives, personal stresses, financial stresses, employment stresses, other kinds of stresses and strains. And it's really widely thought that there must be an element of suicidal ideation, or that these attacks are suicidal, because a very high percentage of the individuals, of course, die in perpetrating their acts, often by suicide by cop, so to speak. And there are scholars, some prominent scholars, that have tried to argue that it is primarily about suicide. But I think overwhelmingly the evidence shows that really actually only a small percentage have actual suicidal ideation, and that suicide is not a key driving factor in motivating these events. So, we have a ballpark notion, but this clearly has massive specificity problem, because huge parts of the population would fit this profile, so it's not really of a great assistance to us. I mean, it does weed it out, but not much. There have been changes in the profile, and this starts the new research is starting to produce interesting results, because this profile has been pretty steady state for decades. Now it's clear that things are starting to change, and they're changing in ways that there's a lot more non-white perpetrators. On average, the age is getting a little older. Many more are married or involved in relationships. We're getting noticeably higher levels of education amongst the perpetrators, and a high percentage of them are actually employed. The more of the attacks are what is described as revenge attacks, right? So that's kind of unique too. Actually, the single largest growth in attacks are attacks that are driven by a revenge motivation, which is interesting. They're less planned, it appears, than in the past. And there's more of a direct link to a very specific precipitating event, like getting fired or bullied at work or ostracized by someone or a group or something of that nature. Now, the problem is, though, that a lot of these changes just reflect broader demographic changes, right? Well, there's more non-white perpetrators. Well, because in the societies where these things are happening, a higher percentage of the population is non-white, right? So, and these changes don't seem to be out of alignment with democratic. They're in alignment, in other words, with democratic changes. So it is changing, but is that change really consequential, or is it just reflecting broader changes in the society? So in the end, all we know is that we actually have a greater diversity, and if anything, this actually means the profile gets weakened even further. So trying to come up with a profile isn't very productive. So that's the second conclusion. The third conclusion that comes out of looking at this research is that and I'm afraid this is a bad news story overall in many regards, as you're going to hear. The third one is that when you go into these very good studies, these are studies published in the leading journals of forensic science, criminology, and terrorism studies, using the most advanced methods available to us with these kinds of data sets for the most part, it's really a message of complexity emerges, right? What we're learning is just how complex the combination of variables are that generate these kinds of incidents. And so there's these terms equifinality and multifinality that are just kicked around in these studies, which the gist of it when it comes down to is that we can now demonstrate. It's not a matter of, we've always suspected, well, these things are very complex. It's hard to tell, what's going to lead to what. But now we actually know if you put factors X, Y, Z, J, K, H, whatever factors you want, because you can have in these studies up to 70 or 80 variables. You pick your variables, you put them together, you work them through the data. You do get pattern, you do get results, but the trouble is you just mix the variables slightly differently and you get completely different results. And so we can sort of safely say that lots of people start from the same space, are subject to a set of variables, but the variables can be different combinations of variables and they'll produce the same result. So you start from this sort of profile maybe and you end up in a violent incident, but the variables that get you from A to B will be at different combinations in each case, right? In different degrees. But you also get a situation where we can recognize that if you try to pursue any one variable, unemployment or mental illness, it operates in different ways with different individuals. So there's really become enormous complexity in trying to figure out what can we predict from any of this research. And sort of really what we mainly now know is it's twice as hard to predict. Now we know why it's so hard to predict, right? We can sort of trace the degree of complexity. We can trace why the issues are complex. So that is a gain, but it's a gain that when you're reading these studies leaves you almost sort of agonizing. So it's really a case of, I'm going to kind of just step out of the presentation here. I made this comment in looking in the big report I did for the International Society for Counterterrorism on studies using empirical data looking at foreign fighters. I had to express at the end that, we have a glass half full, that old sort of metaphor, right? And it's great. It's half full. It was empty before. We actually now at half full, but I said at that end of the report, regrettably, that's just the problem is it's half full, right? I was more concerned about the fact that we still really, it's more of a negative finding, but we know why it's a negative finding now, right? So it's a kind of gain, but it's a complex one. Fourth then, so in terms of lone actor terrorists, this is what I alluded to before. This is something that if you read this, look at the studies in question, this is working from, about 2014 on, a series of these studies have appeared that are actually trying to do direct comparisons of the data on this, on terrorists and on public mass murderers. And it's starting to appear that they are very, very similar. There are distinctions, but the distinctions are not clear and they're not absolute distinctions. They're not distinctions of kind, they're distinction of degree. So the next slide will help to clarify this a bit. This is important because we are broadening the base of what will constitute perpetrators of mass casualty incidents and incorporating terrorists into that, and recognizing that we need to start, as is being recognized in different ways, we need to be looking at all of the literature available on both these kinds of phenomena, and probably just general criminological literature is very pertinent to understanding violent extremism and terrorism. And we know that from other things, but this data is driving us in that direction as well. And what it also does is it augments our understanding that non-ideological factors, we can specify the ways in which and to what degree they're playing a role in generating terrorism, but also the way in which ideological factors are actually involved in public mass murders as well. So that you can't just separate these any longer by saying, on the one side you have the ideologically driven individuals, and on the other side you have the crazies. Right? Doesn't work that way. In fact, they're very, very similar. So we need to take a dimensional approach. Here's a really simplistic diagram because, as I always say at this point, I have no capacity to use sophisticated graphics in, in a PowerPoint. So someday I'll have to get together with like a graphic specialist and work something out. But this captures it all essentially, right? We need to be thinking about a continuum. And on the one side, we have group-based terrorists. At the other extreme, the other pole, you have the solo mass murderers. The lone actors fall somewhere in between. And roughly, it's accurate to say that this group is less alone. You go from less alone to more alone, from less mental illness to more mental illness, from more directed attacks to less directed. You go from more ideological to less ideological. But it's important to recognize this is dimensional, meaning this does not mean over here they're not ideological. It's less ideological. That doesn't mean there isn't mental illness here. It just means there's less mental illness here. And I'll just support this with this graph, which is borrowed from Paul Gill at University College London. So my organization, TSAS, had a conference in October in Ottawa, and we asked Paul to come as one of our many speakers. And Paul did a nice summary overview of sort of insights from the last 15 years or so of all the studies that have been done by him and his colleagues and Emily Corner on all these issues. And he had many brilliant graphs. I just chose one of the simplest ones here because it is just so dramatic in demonstrating, right, that in terms of offenders, as you move from mass murderers through to, he's saying network, but we'll call those group-based terrorists, you see that levels of mental illness go down. This is the national averages. As you can see, as they claim, members of group-based terrorist groups actually have remarkably lower levels of mental illness, where, of course, as we might expect, mass murderers have much higher levels of mental illness, but the levels are still, not that extraordinary. And this is based, the reason for drawing this out is that this is based on comprehensive data from multiple studies, analyzed very critically in various ways, and using both open and closed sources, because a lot of the data is derived from open sources, but very meticulously. But also Paul's been lucky enough to have access to closed data in the UK context in terms of threats to politicians, to the royal family, things of that nature, and the perpetrators of those threats. So the fifth conclusion is that, just drawing on this, then it is fair to say that a large minority of the perpetrators of mass casualty incidents do have some diagnosed mental illness. But I stress it both ways. It's large, but it is a minority, right? So I'm always left stressing this, even in the context of foreign fighters. The vast majority don't have any reliable history of mental health issues. So we have to keep that in mind, right? So we definitely can't support the broad proposition the public wants to, of saying they're crazy, it all can be explained through mental health. There's a tendency in Canada for politicians, as there is in the States, in terms of dealing with public mass murderers. They frequently want to revert to this easy solution. Oh, it's just a mental health issue. We need to improve our mental health, outtakes and care for these people. So the role of mental health in influencing and precipitating the violence is enormously complex. And again, I'm giving you the gist of really, if you go into the research, they follow through the different possibilities. But mainly, is it that mental health issues are compounding pre-existing issues, or are pre-existing issues compounding mental health issues? And of course, it's both. And as they stress, in any individual case, you have to pay a great deal of attention to the sequencing, which is something our data sets do not normally capture, because it does matter which came first. Or, more importantly, they also could be happening simultaneously in complex ways. So they can be traced. I'm saying the data's there, we can trace it, but we now know it's a really complex a process that you're trying to trace. Overwhelmingly, though, we can now say you cannot assign weight to any particular mental disorder in terms of risk factors. So the data does show that mass public murderers, including lone actor terrorists, have higher incidence of schizophrenia. They have higher incidence of delusional disorders. They have higher incidence of autism spectrum disorders. A little asterisk beside that, because a lot of people would not include that amongst mental disorders, and it's classified as neurodiversity. But sidestepping that debate, it shows up in the data available, but these are not, it's not dramatically different. So they are somewhat higher in these regards. But in the dozens of other mental disorders that have been traced in the actual data sets, there's no appreciable connection. So if you go into the paper or you went into my analysis, it's all broken down for like about 16 different mental disorders. And some of the correlations are extremely limited. Like you can actually get it down to, it's 0.6% or something, right? So, and these papers are now using proper baseline information and trying to make comparisons as best we can to national data on these kinds of things. So no one thing particularly stands out. We're really forced to recognize this must be determined on a case-by-case basis now. Now, you can determine it on a case-by-case better when you have the baseline of all of the larger data sets, so you know there are certain things maybe to look for. Don't waste your time looking for dozens of things. There are a few things that might be more probable. So look for evidence of schizophrenia. Look for evidence of delusional disorders. Don't look for evidence of, let's see if I can come up, let's say depression, right? Which you might think, well, depression would be a key factor. Well, turns out, in fact, it isn't in terms of these situations. All right, so conclusion number 6, of a different vein, is that contrary to a lot of people's sort of thinking in this regard too, is most of the mass casualty incidents demonstrate considerable planning. So while I said there is a tendency now to more revenge, a little less directed, attacks, even those attacks show considerable amount of planning. And if you go into the literature, they've documented for different kinds of attacks the different lengths of time involved in planning, right? Or what they mean by planning or constitutes planning. I'm not dwelling on those details here. I'm telling you, though, it does exist in the literature. But if you want a general takeaway, the thing to recognize is that we really shouldn't be thinking about these things as impulsive. So Gabriel Wortman, there was a precipitating event that caused him on the night he undertook his action, domestic dispute. There's a broader precipitating event in the sense that he seemed to be really flipping out about COVID and the pandemic, and he had done things like take $450,000 out of all his investments and buried it, and he was doing other things because he obviously thought the world was about to come, crashing down, and he needed to prepare for it. But he had been carefully preparing all his police paraphernalia and these police cars for a long time, and he did it as under the pretext of admiring the police and being a kind of police, fandom sort of thing going down. But afterwards it came out that he'd had many conversations with neighbors and friends that they thought was odd and weird conversations in which other kind of less appealing motivations seemed to appear as to why he was doing it. So of course he's dead. We can't possibly investigate him to find out why he was doing this. So, but he's an instance of, it appears that for years he had been building towards this. In other cases, you can demonstrate a classic case, just to use a really classic case, would be Anders Breivik, where we all know, if you go into the details, he had meticulously been preparing his attack for at least 2 years before the attack, right? Very carefully developing his bomb materials, very carefully developing his plans. Then, of course, ironically, in the end, he blew it because he was late to arrive at the government buildings to set off the bombs and miss most of the people who had gone home for the holiday weekend, because he hadn't adequately accounted for the fact that when he tried to upload his manuscript onto the internet, it crashed his computer system and he had to run around at the last minute and get a new, as I recall, memory package for his computer or something of that nature. But it was planned carefully. Seventh conclusion is that, and again, this is something that for those who are involved in terrorism studies, you would be aware of already probably, but it's up here because all of the studies are showing it with remarkable consistency, and that is that a really high percentage of all of the kinds of perpetrators of all types of mass casualty incidents engage in leakage. They, contrary to what is maybe the popular perception, is they talk. They talk a lot about what they're planning to do, why they're planning to do it, some cases even exactly how they're planning to do it. And the value of looking at the research is the research now is quite specific as to what kinds of talking they do, where they do it, in person or online, to who, at what times. That's now all been documented. So, but the general takeaway is to recognize that 30 to 40%, depending on the nature of the attack, right, are engaging in this leakage. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about significant leakage, not a minor comment. I mean, they actually have sat with someone, or they've talked on the phone, or they've talked through a chat forum about, I'm going to blow these guys up, you know, here's how I intend to do it, fairly specific information. So clearly, leakage is enormously important. It provides a great avenue for detection and prevention, and it does raise these really difficult problems, though, about how do we take advantage of that leakage, right? Because clearly we can't be monitoring people and violating their privacy. We need to get the people who are, you know, the recipients of the leakage to recognize their need to contact authorities. And in the case of Gabriel Wortman, just as elsewhere, the commission found that, of course, as I said, many neighbors had for years had suspicions and worries, but nothing had been said to the police or to anyone of any consequence, right? It had been kept to themselves. But it definitely also shows that even the so-called lone actor terrorists are certainly not alone. In fact, actually, they think of themselves as being part of a community. They reach out to find communities. They seek to speak to people. The eighth conclusion, and this one I'll have to honestly admit, I'll have to fess up here. This isn't something that comes specifically out of the studies. It's what is overwhelming impression when you read all this literature. Because the one thing that seems to just stand out is that all these individuals are people who have a grievance, have a beef. And they are obsessed with this grievance. They are locked into it. They cannot be deterred from the grievance. So an atypical preoccupation with grievances, lots of people have grievances, but it's clear we're dealing with individuals that anyone talking to them would soon discover they really have something that is grinding at them and bothering them. It's a defining motif. And in Gill's work and a few other places, they've tried to figure out ways to statistically get at this. I don't deal with it, I mentioned here, but I'll just say if you were to look at the report, and actually I have a publication I've submitted on this. If it comes out, then it would be available that way too. They have tried to find ways of measuring this and getting at it, but right now the way the data has been collected, it's hard. You're left with very indirect sort of proxy measures, but so that's something that needs to be done in the future, is to develop a more effective way of getting at that. The ninth conclusion is something that is this is where we're at, where people are at in the research. I shouldn't even say we, because I'm not actively doing the new research, but if you were Emily Corner or Paul Gill or Adam Langford or any of the people involved in this, this is sort of the state we're at now. We're getting a real good grasp of the relative presence and prevalence of a wide variety of factors and the various ways in which they're interacting in complex ways to produce these negative results. But what we don't have is enough data on relevance, right? On the relevance or significance of individual variables or specific combination of variables. And regrettably, that's because really the only way we can get that, as always seems to be the case, is we need more data, but the data we need is much more refined data, right? Idiosyncratic data that can only come from case studies. So we're back to where often that happens in this literature. We need people to develop case studies, a lot more case studies, and more importantly, in light of all of this larger data, to start developing systematically comparable case studies so that we don't have case studies that, well, they found interesting things, but the way they approach things don't allow for a very reliable comparison. And I think we need to spend more attention on, because there is good literature about how you can develop theory out of case studies that is underplayed in our fields of study, and we need to more systematically train people in recognizing how case studies can be used to develop theory, and then the theory can be fitted in with these larger data studies, and we can get a positive hermeneutic loop going between these two different ways of gathering pertinent data. So in terms of my final conclusions, I'm not sure how I'm doing time-wise. Okay. So these are not, I mean, this is not a I gotcha kind of presentation, right? There's no big, special surprising result here. It's more a way of saying, look, we're going a certain direction. And this is where me as a sociologist and not being a criminologist probably comes more into play here, right? So what do we learn, right? Well, we learn, we actually do have a much more sophisticated grasp now than we did 10 years ago of all this phenomenon. And why sophisticated? I don't mean just theoretically. I'm talking, as is clear, data. We have lots of data, rich data, multiple repeats of data. Proviso, one of the problems right now is all the systematic reviews stress is that, of course, all the studies are done with slightly different methodologies, slightly different definitions, slightly different data sets, etc. So again, you do have problems, and some of the studies have methodological flaws, and some of the studies recognize their methodological limitations, and some don't. But at least we're getting a point where there's a pretty sophisticated dialogue starting, courtesy of the systematic reviews, about these issues. So we probably could be moving to the next phase of studies where you could attempt to correct those fundamental flaws, right? So we have a better grasp of the variables, the possible relevance of many of the variables. That is an important foundation has been laid for future research. We have this really, in a more general sense, we have a much more heightened appreciation, or we should, and when we're talking to the commissioners, that's what we're trying to get them to recognize. We said, you probably understand this is a complex issue, but now we're letting you know it's a really complex issue, right? More complex than probably is appreciated. So it is a social problem. Now, obviously, in countries like the United States, it is an overwhelming social problem, which they seem to be doing their best to stick their heads in the ground and ignore, right, for political reasons. But it is probably a rising social problem even in countries like Canada, Sweden, and elsewhere in the world, which is, of course, concerning. And as a social problem, we do have to respond to it. So we really have to be careful that our responses aren't too simplistic, right? Not too politically driven, and we need to be driven more by, the data as much as possible. Now, we need to work out the implications of our more sophisticated approach in terms of risk assessment. And Gill and others are doing this. I'm not going to comment on this because I'm not an expert in risk assessment literature. Those who are experts are paying attention to these other developments, and it's being factored into risk assessment. But the more you factor it into the risk assessments from looking at the initial studies, we do have some harsh facts you have to deal with, right? That in a funny way, the more sophisticated we attempt to work this all out, the more we're aware of the possibility of false positives, right? It's actually almost comes with the territory. Now, at least the flip side of the coin positive is our awareness of the false positive issues more, right? And to get that false positive issue as a driving force to try and be even better. But it also, I think, reduces our confidence in meaningfully engaging in preventative interdiction. Because the likelihood of being accurately predict whether a person's falling down a path to violence, we're increasingly understanding is very limited, extremely limited. So my sociologist comes out, and these are admittedly very sweeping kind of comments, is that I have less faith in us developing programs of interdiction other than just standard criminological behavior, criminal prevention behavior, right? Than I do in recognizing that it's not a very good solution, but social prophylactic measures are probably about the best we can come up with. The one thing that stands out from the literature is that for all the perpetrators of mass casual incidents of whatever kind, it's almost always a compounding of stressors that leads to the net result. And the stressors are, fairly straightforward ones in terms of social marginalization, economic opportunities, things of this nature, combined with mental health, etc. I'm not going to get into it here. We all know the vast literature is talking about the mounting stresses that are happening in all of our lives, particularly younger people's lives, and in marginalized elements of our societies. So we do need to just keep working on the multiple stressors that people are being subject to, and design societies that try to provide broader means of reducing those stressors, right? If you want to prevent these kinds of dramatic incidents with mass casualties, you need to make life better for people overall. I know it sounds simplistic, but it adds great emphasis to it. We also, though, need to reduce the opportunities, right? And so, again, I'm just driving an obvious point, right? We know the political realities, but in Canada, the mass casualty event, plus some others that have happened in Canada, has driven new gun legislation. Is it controversial? Yes. Is it, are the political parties fighting about it? Yes. But overwhelmingly, the Canadian public shows 70% or higher levels of support for more advanced gun control. We were already a society compared to the United States of substantial gun control, but now even more gun control measures coming into play. So that virtually down the road in Canada, the only persons that will have guns would be, farmers, etc., that can demonstrate they need certain limited kinds of guns to protect their livestock, and those who are involved in like competitive shooting or something of that nature, and even then, only with very limited guns. Simple answer, societies like, if you take a country like Scotland with strict gun control, dramatically lower incidence of mass casualty incidents versus the United States. Locations in the United States, if you look at the data on mass casualty incidents in the United States, a pretty clear thing emerges right away. And pardon, I'm going to use really just popular language here to drive the point home. You look at it and say, good God, a shitload of these things happen in Texas. Well, I wonder why, because in Texas you're going to carry a gun anywhere, right? As a Canadian, I always remember walking into an extremely high, classy hotel where an event was happening in Houston, and a lovely, beautiful brass plaque, all beautifully done because it's a classy hotel. Everything would have to be classy. Right at the front desk as you check in, saying, anyone with a concealed weapon must check it at the desk. So let's just try and live in societies where you don't need such plaques, right? That would go a long way to helping things. I'm going to push further. As ours also show, though, we really do need to think in terms of norms and values, because it hasn't been explored yet, but there is some evidence from all these studies that if these individuals didn't live, one of the opportunity structures here is if these individuals didn't live in contexts or societies where they thought using weapons or reverting to violence was a somewhat normatively expected or accepted way of resolving their issues, they wouldn't have gone in that direction. So there's a little bit of research, but we need more to really look at this comparatively, to look at contexts where the norms and values are markedly against violence, public perpetrations of violence, versus contexts like Texas, which has a reverse mindset, and try to figure out ways to trace that influence. And as a result, more importantly, we need to obviously create societies that are joining in that. And this fits into the societal functions of violence. This is another broader area of research in sociology that I think needs to be brought to bear here, is that as a good sociologist, I always harken back to our founding figures. So I harken back to really old saws like Durkheim talking about crime, and basically saying, his metaphor about a society of saints. If you lived in a society of saints, then all that would happen is very minor offenses would become major offenses, right? And because what he's really saying is there's social functions to crime. There's social functions to differentiating between those who are criminal or not. We need to understand the ways in which some societies have structured into themselves violence as playing an actual role in the society, even though they may say it's not. Like it could be argued in the United States, violence is coded in the DNA of the societal structure, and that it has functions in that society, and those functions are implicitly recognized by huge sections of that society, and as a result, it really does take away from the desire to have norms that would reduce it. So we need to better understand the social structural functions of violence in any kind of societal context. And if it has a function, then let's be sociologists and stick to simple factors. Let's figure out alternative mechanisms by which that function could be served in societies. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorne. I will take the advantage of being the moderator and ask you the first question. We have in our collaboration discussed a lot about the Atlantic divide. Is there a difference between extremism and attacks in America versus Europe? In this context, can you see differences and similarities between lone actors in Europe and contra Canada and the US?
It's a really interesting question, and I can't give like a quick and easy answer because, of course, didn't have those glasses on when I was looking at the data. And of course, glasses I did have on because I was talking to Canadian commissioners was the contrast between the United States and Canada, right? Which, when you're a Canadian, you spend your whole life comparing yourself to the United States and the ways you're not American, right? There's clearly a massive divide between Canada and the United States, and a simplistic way of reading that, but it's not inaccurate, is, of course, it's that very element of Canada that harkens more to Europe, right, and to European models in governance and in all kinds of things. Even in our policing, so I work with the RCMP quite a lot. The RCMP, yes, they work with the FBI and they work with American officials. They have to because of the nature of the border. But I've noticed that in dealing with these issues, the RCMP look to the Metropolitan Police in London, and that all of their interviewing techniques and their police interviewers, have all now been trained by the Metropolitan Police in London, and they're following a British model, and they're consciously aware they're developing that model over against the FBI model because they just see it as more, effective. Now, that's, I think, why they're saying it's effective also is because they're saying our context is more like the British context than it is the American context, right? So, I don't have a direct answer. I think it would be very intriguing to look at specific incidents of mass casualty incidents and different types, the different types you can break down, and see if you do it. And none of these 50 studies, not one of them, differentiate a European from a North American context. The vast majority of the studies are working with exclusively US data. Ironically, even Paul Gill's studies, based in the UK, about half of them are working with US data. Now, part of this is because it's being funded by, the Department of Justice and National Institute of Justice and things of that nature. So,
thank you. We'll start. Do we have any questions from online, but maybe from the audience in the room? Christopher Edling.
Thanks. Yeah, coming back to one of the earlier points, you were talking about the revenge motivation. That I found intriguing. It seems to ring sort of a bell also in the ongoing lethal, violent, gang-related extremism or violence that we see in Sweden. That seems to be remoted by revenge and sort of revenging very, very petty offenses. So as a sociologist, I guess that you could sort of expand on this theme a little bit. Also in this context, but perhaps going beyond lone actors and mass murders.
I think it's something that it's actually an issue that needs to be explored. And so I'll come back to the question, bring me directly back to the question. I want to seize on a slight diversion. So what I spend a lot of my time doing, for example, I've just did a paper on crime-terror nexus and the role of the desire for redemption for people to become involved in jihadists, so criminals who become jihadists. One of the recognized motivations is redemption, but the nature of my paper is that if you actually look at all the research, everybody mentions it and nobody studies it, right? And so the paper is designed to make a good argument for why we need to be taking this idea of redemption motivation seriously, and not assuming that what really the crime-terror nexusism is about is simply a commonality of criminality or criminal mindset or criminal structural context. It's way more complex for many individuals. So I think the revenge thing is something similar. I'm going by memory, so I'm not going to be held totally accurate. In looking at the different kinds of shootings, school shooters, work shootings, rampage shootings, that kind of thing. This is where it started to come out in the data that in trend analysis over 20 to some studies 40 years, some studies 20 years, with American data, those revenge-motivated shootings, they're coming up, where others are staying static or going down. So ideological attacks, static. School shootings, I can't remember. I think they're actually even coming down, believe it or not. But revenge ones are going up, and they're very commonly work-related ones, right? And where it's clear there's a revenge motivation. But what hasn't been done is a nitty-gritty analysis of, well, what kinds of grievances? What kinds of revenge? How do they understand revenge? Why do they think they need to get vengeance, right? Because we're not dealing with, where the only place that has been studied is honor societies, right? Honor cultures. But this is not an honor culture. Is it or is it? Maybe it is an honor culture thing in terms of the US context. In Canada, the nearest thing equivalent, I think, that would fit the Swedish example is, of course, there's tremendous problems with gun violence, significant gun violence, between gangs, youth gangs in Toronto, which for Canada, and there was in Vancouver, but Vancouver seems to have kind of gone quiescent. Toronto's continuing to thrive. And it's causing, and it's not a little atypical because you don't find it much else in Canada, but certainly in the Toronto environment where we've got. And it's this kinds of shootings that is really getting disturbing. Ever younger shooters over ever more petty things. There's also been piles of stabbings of students, like 13-year-olds at school, being stabbed by 5 other 13-year-olds, right? And somewhat gang connected. And it is revenge motivated. Almost always it's because, oh, you offended so-and-so, you hurt so-and-so, we're just tit for tat kind of stuff. That's great. But we need more. And maybe if I were a gang violence person, I'd say, oh no, that's already been done. But my suspicion is I bet it hasn't. Because I have looked really closely at the literature on involvement in gangs and involvement in terrorism and the ways in which they parallel and differ. There's some interesting initial research on that. It still is a topic that has not been adequately explored in depth. And the revenge issue, I think, would be something that'd be really intriguing. I'm a real proponent, I guess, to go back to where I started, of drilling down on these motivations. And that paper I just alluded to about redemption, I shouldn't say this publicly. Well, there's going to be a special issue of a journal dealing with motivations, and that's where we're hoping it will appear. It sort of received some initial acceptance. We hope it'll ultimately appear in the issue, because the leading scholars generating that special issue in a very important journal, they recognize this too, that motivation, and what the hell is a motivation? I mean, even conceptually, what do we mean by motivation? How do you track them? How do you perceive them? How do you investigate them? That's a real key issue. And revenge, I'm a little nebulous about revenge. They say revenge. I'm not sure that's an accurate descriptor of what's going on there. Andrew Silk, some years ago in the European Journal of Criminology, tried to argue that revenge was a key motivator for terrorism, especially lone actor terrorism. I didn't buy his argument. So whatever, I think that's something that really needs to be investigated.
Thank you. Barb or Davud, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Lorne. My question is about the need for profiling. Like at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that there is a pressure or need for profiling these lone actors or mass shooters. And on the other hand, we have the complexity. Like out of all of these 9 themes, we can say that there's no way to profile people, at least like 30%, 40%, the percentages that you gave. So out of these 50 studies, can we say that like profiling is not possible? So we should let people know that we should stop having that pressure or need, because when we look at the criminal profiling literature, there is also the same thing. It's really hard to profile criminals. The same thing goes with the terrorists or lone actors here from your study. So can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, so that's the general tendency is, there was this tremendous pressure about profiling, attempts to develop different kinds of profiles, right? Psychological profiles, social, economic profiles, even, racial, ethnic profiles, right? All of which have failed for various reasons. And then it leads to the general conclusion, oh, well, profiling is not possible, we shouldn't profile. Then you go to the actual studies, like Gill's studies, and he would argue, well, no, wait a minute, we can profile to a point. We just have to be very much more careful and sophisticated about it. And in our fields of study, we constantly have issues like, oh, it's all about radicalization. Or what the hell is radicalization? Oh, it's such a problematic, complicated term. It's not of any value. Throw it out. But it doesn't get thrown out because it has high utility. And it gets used. The urge and desire to profile is going to persist, whether we want to say it can't or not. I think a more sophisticated answer is to develop more complex or more refined profiles. So in other words, there's not a profile for lone actors. There's not a profile for public mass murderers or perpetrators of mass casualty incidents. There's not a profile for lone actor terrorists, if we keep going down. We've got to even break it down further into subtypes. And then you can start to say there's some degree. So let's, for example, if you can demonstrate that an individual actually had a diagnosed mental disorder, and you know what the diagnosis was, then you can, as is being done in some case studies with autism, really have sophisticated awareness. These papers are now being written by people who are clinical specialists in autism. So they know how autism impairs individuals. They also know the complexity of the various variety of things get classified as autism. But they're able to say there is a linkage between some of the most well-known and well-established, most common features of autism and some of the things you see in perpetrators of these events. So in other words, you get sub-profile, right? And yeah, we're just going to endlessly run into the complexity issue, but I don't think you're ever going to get rid of the desire to profile. So rather than just saying, oh, there's no profiling, I think it means like everything else, sorry guys, we just have to be a hell of a lot more sophisticated and limited in the range of our profiles. But because some profilings, if you want to flip it to the other side, we have really important social function, right? And so even in the case of those criminal profiles, I've read the studies that are highly negative about the actual original process of profiling serial murders and things of that nature hasn't removed the public and taste for profiling or institutional taste or desire for profiling. So everyone has to be educated to more sophisticated use of the profiles.
Thanks for the presentation. Super interesting as usual. So my question is related to the sort of like common ground that you were talking about, the preoccupation with grievances that we've come back to now. But I wonder, one of the elements you talked about but didn't maybe mention towards the end of your presentation was the fact that most of the perpetrators tend to be men.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if, and not because any biological factors, but one of the things I've been thinking more and more is the normalization of toxic masculinities, which we were all familiar with, but there's not as much talk about it, I feel. And so maybe toxic masculinity is not only related to extremist ideologies and extremist movements, but also the normalization of expectations and gender expectations within societies. And for example, the idea that you're allowed to react aggressively when you think that the society is not living to your expectations based on what you grew up thinking that your role was in society based on your gender. So I wonder, because you were talking about the societal function of violence and looking for alternative ways to meet those functions without violence, and I wonder what your thoughts are on alternative gender, profiles and expectations, or whether we remove those altogether, or what the role it's been on harmful gender expectations in feeding that type of violence.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a big issue, Barbara, and really a key, and I won't claim expertise in it because in a way we purposefully copped out, I mean, if you want to put it that way. We knew another team had been hired who were experts dealing with the gender issue. So we kind of just, we won't look at those studies, right? We'll concentrate elsewhere. But of course, I read some of the literature. And I know it's still not adequately developed, but there's some good research on it. Clearly demonstrates gender is important. There's alternative opinions as to why it's important and how it's important. And I don't think we've arrived anywhere near the point where it's beyond more than being speculative. This toxic masculinity or masculinity in general is really key. And I can't, of someone I know, Joshua Roos, he's one of the authors with others, but I happen to know Joshua, just published a book on masculinity and violent extremism. And I just know him through Avert in Australia, so I've dealt with him online, etc. So clearly some literature, and book-length literature, is starting to come out on these specific issues now and their relevance. So, and it's overwhelming that gender is we're talking 90 to 95% of mass casualty incidents are perpetrated by males. And like everything else, while there's a minor increase in women engaging in these actions, it's still low. Compared to other kinds of crime where women are actually more involved, these kinds of incidents, it's a small uptick. It's really still overwhelmingly, when you're talking mass casualty incident, overwhelmingly a masculine phenomenon. So it's something that really needs to be explored much more exhaustively, and I can't say much more than that. And then I will say that, as you said, of course we need to explore it in terms of broader societal context, right? So I'm always a little leery again of looking at masculinity as a silver bullet, right? Because I think it's the masculinity again issue may actually just be the tip of the iceberg of something that's a bigger issue in terms of societal affordances for violence, right? But
thank you. It's okay. Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation. I was wanting to sort of circle back to what you said at the beginning, that you had this definition of these mass casualty incidents, and it just happened to be that in Canada there weren't so many, but in contrast in the US there would be there would be 40 every couple of months. And how that ended up sort of generating these results that you had, and that this would change depending on the context of mass casualty incidents that occur. So if we take the United States, for example, we would end up with a very different group of people that we would be describing here. And some of those people might be people who we'd consider like street gang members, but maybe some would be more equivalent to the people you've described. And I'm just wondering, do we get to a point then where we just end up going back to, well, let's look at actually what the motivations were and who the people are, and do we ending up at a profile anyway of sort of an ideal type because there's just too much then, and it just ends up in, if we're going to try to prevent crime, we need to target our interventions towards the types of people that that are committing these things. And it's going to be very different for white males who are, I don't know, mildly educated versus people who are maybe minorities living in urban poverty. So,
yeah. No, I agree. And so just to maybe correct something at the beginning, I fully accept responsibility. It's from the way I presented things too. In all of these data sets, things like gang violence are excluded. Right? So in the definitional process, anything that was, let's say, domestic violence. So if you kill your whole family, then you go out and kill a few other people. Even then, usually it's excluded because it's probably primarily a domestic event that just boiled over, right? And then you're going out to get killed by a cop or something. So if it's domestic, or if it's crime related, organized crime, like a one organized crime group assassinating another one, or if it's gang violence like we were talking about before, that's excluded. So you are dealing with more of these, as I say, public mass murders that, I mean, they're actually, in a funny way, they're defined by the very fact that we're almost always left saying, why the hell would someone do that? Just go out and kill a bunch of strangers, right? So then to get into the broader question, yeah, I think in a funny way we do need to, it does drive us back to profiling of a sort, and it does drive us to the motivation question, because I like you brought up education, and that's one of the ones I like to look at, because in other research that we published in the past and that we will be hoping to publish, when you do comparisons of Australia and Canada, or comparisons of North America and Europe, or now we discover comparisons of Sweden and Canada, there are marked differences in the educational levels of the terrorists, with North Americans and Canadians in particular being a particularly well-educated bunch of terrorists. And you'd say, oh, well, okay, then this must be true of Australia. No, it turns out Australia is a remarkably similar society to Canada, but incredibly low levels of education for Australian terrorists. Almost all the Canadian terrorists have university education, right? Almost none of the Australian terrorists get out of high school, right? So is this then just demonstrate, well, education isn't a relevant factor at all? Or, because you can flip it on its head and say, or are we got to recognize that if you're well-educated or not well-educated, your motivations may be different? Is that possible? Well, again, we're back to the whole point, well, how could we know? We'd need to talk to the damn terrorists. And nobody's done it. And nobody's done it in terms of those factors. From a Canadian context, it's important because you could say, okay, we have lower levels of terrorist incidents in Canada because the people who become terrorists in Canada are well-educated, and well-educated people on the whole don't tend to perpetrate terrorism. So the only reason that we have lower levels, I'm really being simplistic obviously, the only reason we have lower levels of terrorism in Canada is because we have high levels of public education. Like, more people have a university degree in Canada than any other nation on the planet, right? So is that our simple social prophylactic? Give everybody a university degree, and as a result you have lower terrorism. Flip at it and say, well, why would someone that is an engineer or an accountant or a doctor or even just third year in university perpetrate one of these crimes? That's what I find more intriguing, right? My argument is I think education is a non-factor. I think that there's a common motivation that is that shows that education is not a factor. But these are the kind of things we need to investigate. These are all hunches. What really is going on here? So I don't think it's in a way it's not profiling, but we got to go back into those elements that might be in a profile, like I said, with gender, with education, whatever, and figure out more clearly what's going on. I am prejudiced by the fact that I'm not only a sociologist, I'm largely out of a tradition called symbolic interactionism, which will mean nothing to criminologists, I don't think, for the most part. So, I mean, I'm always driven back to definition of the situation, right? I'm always driven back to the single most important variable. It doesn't mean it's the originating variable, but it's probably the most important variable because it's how the person interprets their situation, no matter what was driving it. It's how, at the moment of engaging in the calculation that's going to lead to violence, you're interpreting things. That's what we need to understand. We need to understand how the perpetrator is defining the situation. And I believe there is a lot of prejudices in the literature about that, so that there's a lot of mirroring going on. People maybe take a rational choice perspective and then try and interpret the person's way of understanding things in terms of rational choice principles. It's a helpful heuristic to a point. I don't think it ultimately does the job. Or they revert to they're crazy and they're just driven by men. That doesn't really prove to be very helpful either. We have to get much more careful in understanding. Now, if that's true, then symbolic interaction also leads me to believe that there might be repertoires. So there'll be cultural repertoires that people are calling upon to interpret and define their situations, which lead them to believe that they have no choice but to engage in violence. This comes back then to the gender issue too. So symbolic interactionists have looked at violent perpetrators of rapes, like armed robberies, and to some extent through interviewing them in prison, demonstrated that really a lot of the problem is these are men largely who lack the resources to be able to interpret the signals in social situations correctly, and they think I've got like two options. That guy dissed me, so I can either like be a coward and walk away, or I have to punch him in the face. And in talking to people, of course, they discover as they're in prison, oh, there are other options. There's ways I can maintain my dignity without reverting to that, right? Or because that woman said that means she really wants me. No, not so much. You're misreading the data, misreading the information, right? Again, I'm being simplistic, but those studies by Lonnie Athens and others, I think really are important, and they need to be transferred, knowledge translation, and they need to be transferred in the context of violent extremism, so that we're getting a much more refined sense of how does... I tried to do it in the work I've done on social ecology of jihadist attacks, and I have a new chapter coming out in a book. It's been long delayed, hopefully this year, where I tried to make it a little more sophisticated and go into more work about adolescence. We need to understand a lot more about how an 18-year-old guy in suburban Toronto is interpreting his world in general. Then if he's an immigrant, factor that in, and you keep factoring in things. If his mother recently died, well, factor in what we know about how adolescents who have a parent die react, right? And recognize those things are going to play into here. And then, as I said, it's going to be the combination of the fact that they're young, they're an immigrant, they're living in a certain community, and their parent just died. And then the contingent factor. They never ever meet a jihadist recruiter or a friend who's gung-ho about jihadism. They go on to be a social worker. But instead, they happen to meet at the mosque when they're really curious about their religion, the guy who just came back from Afghanistan, or his brother did, or whatever, and they're off on another course. And then I'm going to take a chance, as I'm really going way off topic here, but I'll take it. I think a key thing in here, and it's coming out more and more in the case studies, and often people don't even realize they're bringing it out, fantasy. So in the social ecology one, no, actually I'm mixing up another publication. We did a publication where we looked a little closer at the perpetrators of the Toronto 18 attack for a volume that came out on them. There's a copious amount of fantasizing going on. I recently just rewatched 800 Meters about the attack in Barcelona, terrorist attack in Barcelona. You listen to these guys online, they're living in a fantasy world. And so, of course, from the outsider, and you talk to police officers, they scoff, idiots, they don't know. Listen to this bullshit this guy's boasting about. How about we listen to what is going on when an 18-year-old is fantasizing about what a great impact they're going to have on the world by doing X, Y, and Z, right? There's an important and understandable process going on there. And if we're all honest, we can all put ourselves back in that 18-year-old's, mindset and realize how we had naive notions, how we sitting in our basement, I'm going to reveal myself, dating myself, sitting on some substance that maybe has expanded your consciousness, staring at a candle, talking about Jean-Paul Sartre nausea that you just read, and thinking that by all of you understanding nausea, you were somehow going to become this elevated person who was going to have an impact on the world. Instead, you grow up to be accountants, teachers, whatever, like everybody else, right? But at that point, you're willing to do things as a result of that fantasizing that you wouldn't do when you're 24, as we know from the crime data, right? Or you're 20 or 32 or whatever. But it's a real motivator when you're 18. We haven't explored that yet. So.
Any more questions? No? Yeah. Otherwise, as always, very interesting, Lorne, and thank you for the presentation and the privilege of hosting you here.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Really appreciated it.
Thank you.